The Sunday morning coffee tasted of burnt chicory and quiet routine. My son called. He said, "I'm married tomorrow. I withdrew all the money from your bank accounts and sold the house. Bye." The line clicked into a hollow, mocking drone. I sat in the sunlit kitchen, staring at the dust motes dancing in the heat. Then, a sound bubbled up from my chest. I just laughed. He didn't know that the house he sold was actually my decrepit rental property on Oak Street. My hands did not shake as I set the ceramic mug down. I thought of Derek's smooth, honeyed voice and his sharp fiancée, Brittany. They had visited 6 weeks ago, her eyes roaming over my vintage mantel clock like a vulture. Derek had squeezed her hand, smiling as he asked about my automatic bill payments. I had raised him alone, working 2 jobs until my bones ached. Now, the betrayal felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. He wanted my life. I walked to the heavy oak filing cabinet in the hallway. The wood felt cool and solid under my palms. Inside the folder labeled property, the deed for my current home sat untouched. This house was held in a private family trust Derek never bothered to understand. He assumed the modest suburban rental was my only asset. The fool had sold a house occupied by tenants, with 18 months left on their lease. He had just signed a contract for his own criminal destruction. Memory flickered back to the hospital room last winter. I was delirious with pneumonia, my lungs burning like hot coals. Derek had brought papers to my bedside, whispering they were simple insurance forms. I had signed them with a trembling hand, trusting my only child. That was the day he forged the power of attorney. He had been planning this theft while I fought for every breath. My love had blinded me to the predator I raised in my own home. I called my attorney, Martin. While the afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, my voice remained steady, a sharp contrast to the storm rising in my gut. I told him about the bank transfers and the fraudulent sale. We had to act before the wedding breakfast began tomorrow morning. Derek was likely at the Riverside Country Club right now, spending my savings on white roses and crystal chandeliers. I felt a strange, icy peace. The hunt was over, and the reckoning had finally begun. The police report was filed by sunset. Over the following months, my attorney and the prosecutor built a mountain of evidence while I sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood children play in the street. Finally, the morning of the trial arrived. Derek's wedding would proceed, but the title company would freeze every cent by noon. He wanted a fresh start with his calculating bride on my dime. Instead, he would find the bank accounts locked and the buyers filing for fraud. I sipped my tea, listening to the crickets. My son thought he had left me with nothing. He forgot I taught him how to fight. The heavy courthouse doors groaned open on Monday morning. I sat behind the prosecution table, wearing my best navy suit. Martin tapped his pen against a thick stack of bank statements. My son sat across the aisle, his face pale and eyes twitching. Brittany leaned toward his ear, whispering through a tight, painted smile. She looked at me with pure venom. The air in the room felt thin. Today, the family secret would become public record. The prosecutor stood and described the unauthorized transfers. She spoke about the forged notary seal and my hospital stay. Derek's lawyer tried to claim I was simply confused and elderly. I watched the jury's faces as the evidence mounted. They saw the receipts from the Riverside Country Club. My stolen savings had paid for their lobster and silk ribbons. Derek shifted in his seat, avoiding my steady gaze. He looked like a cornered animal in a tuxedo. I took the stand with a calm I didn't truly feel. The defense attorney paced like a wolf near the wooden railing. He asked if I resented my son's new marriage. I told him I only resented the theft of my future. The lawyer produced a paper, claiming I signed it willingly. I leaned forward to inspect the blurry ink. That signature was a jagged mess from my feverish hand. The room went silent as I pointed at the date. The defense attorney's face reddened as he checked the calendar. That specific Tuesday, I was hooked to a ventilator in the intensive care unit. The hospital records showed I was barely conscious. Derek had leaned over my bed while I struggled for oxygen. He didn't see a mother, he saw a vault to crack open. I saw the jury members lean in closer. The power shifted as a judge adjusted her spectacles. Derek's lawyer suddenly stopped his aggressive pacing. The daybreak brought a desperate confrontation in the hallway. Derek cornered me near the water fountain, smelling of cheap mints. He begged me to tell the court I had forgotten our deal. He promised to pay it all back with interest. Brittany stood behind him. Her arms crossed over a designer coat. She hissed that I was destroying his career in finance. I looked at my son and saw a complete stranger. His apology felt hollow. I returned to the courtroom and listened to the final testimonies. The tenants from the Oak Street rental property spoke next. They described the fear of losing their home to strangers. Derek had sold their lives away without a single thought. The buyers were already suing him for fraud and damages. My son's face crumbled as the sheer scale of his debt was calculated. He had lost everything trying to steal my modest life. The jury left to deliberate. The verdict came 3 hours later with a sharp, final crack. Guilty on all counts. The foreperson stated with firm conviction. Derek slumped forward as the bailiff reached for his silver handcuffs. Brittany didn't cry or reach out to touch his arm. She turned and walked toward the exit without a backward glance. I felt a strange hollow ache in my chest. Justice was served, but I was still walking home alone. The son I loved was dead. The cold metal click of handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Derek was led away toward the holding cells, without looking back once. I stood alone near the empty jury box, my legs feeling heavy. The wooden benches were mostly deserted now, save for a few janitors. Martin gathered his folders and offered a quiet, sympathetic nod of support. I felt the weight of my victory, like a heavy stone in my stomach. Justice had a very bitter flavor this afternoon. I walked out into the biting wind of the city street. The sun was low, casting long and jagged shadows across the gray pavement. Brittany was nowhere to be seen, her absence as sharp as a blade. She had fled the moment the verdict was read aloud. I unlocked my car and sat in the quiet, dim interior for a long time. My reflection in the mirror looked 10 years older than my 60th birthday. My son was a felon, and I was the cause. 3 days later, the first restitution notice arrived in my mailbox. It was a formal document detailing the seizure of Derek's frozen condo funds. I took the paper to my kitchen table and brewed some tea. The steam rose in the quiet air, a ghost of my former life. I realized that the money would return, but my heart remained shattered. I had my savings back, yet the house felt entirely too large. The silence in the rooms was deafening. A knock at the door startled me from my dark thoughts. It was Tom Henderson, the tenant from the Oak Street rental house. He held a small box of chocolates and looked very nervous. He thanked me for fighting the sale and saving his family's home. His children had been terrified of moving to a shelter. I invited him in, realizing I had saved more than just my bank account. My choices had real consequences for innocent people. We sat in the living room, talking about the future of the rental. Tom mentioned that a strange man had been seen lurking near the property. He described a tall figure in a dark hoodie, taking detailed notes. My pulse quickened as I realized the buyers weren't finished with their legal war. They wanted the land, not just their money back. Derek's fraud had opened a door I couldn't easily close. New threats were emerging from the legal wreckage. I spent the evening reviewing the original land deed with a flashlight. My late husband had mentioned a specific mineral, right clause decades ago. If the buyers found it, they could force a sale through the court. I found the hidden annex tucked behind a dusty property map. The rights were actually split between the house and the neighbor's yard. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was sitting on a dormant and extremely valuable oil vein. The phone rang at midnight, breaking the heavy stillness of the house. I expected a bill collector, or perhaps a final plea from prison. Instead, a gravelly voice informed me that the Oak Street title was contested. The buyers had discovered the mineral rights and were filing a new injunction. They didn't want the restitution anymore. They wanted the entire plot of land. I hung up the phone, realizing the battle had only just begun. Derek's mistake was bigger. I drove to the county records office as the morning mist clung to the asphalt. My objective was simply secure the original survey maps of Oak Street. The lobby smelled of old paper and floor wax. I waited behind a frosted glass partition while a clerk searched the archives. The buyers were aggressive, and their new injunction threatened to strip my assets. I felt the cold pressure of a ticking clock. My family history was at stake. The clerk returned with a tattered vellum roll that crackled in the quiet room. I spread the map across a wide oak table. The ink was faded, but the lines were clear. My late husband's notes were scribbled in the margins in blue pencil. I traced the boundary lines with a trembling finger. The mineral rights were explicitly linked to the deep shale layers beneath the garden. It was a complex web of legal ownership. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the table, blocking the dim overhead light. I looked up to see the lead buyer, a man named Sterling, standing there. He wore an expensive wool coat and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He told me that fighting was useless because Derek had already signed a secondary disclosure. My stomach churned at the thought of another betrayal. Derek had sold the rights behind my back months ago. Sterling leaned closer, his voice a low and raspy whisper. He offered to drop the lawsuits if I signed over the main house trust today. He claimed Derek owed his associates a significant debt from a failed gambling venture. The theft of my savings was just a drop in a much deeper bucket. My son had been drowning long before the wedding bells rang. The pressure in my chest felt like an iron band. I stood my ground, clutching the old map to my chest. I told Sterling that a forged power of attorney made every secondary signature void. His smirk flickered for a second before hardening into a mask of pure steel. He reminded me that accidents happen to old women living alone in large houses. It was a blatant threat delivered with a chilling smile. He turned and walked away. I was now a target. I retreated to my car and locked the doors immediately. The sensory details of the parking lot felt heightened and sharp. I saw a black sedan idling near the exit with tinted windows. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized that the law might be too slow to protect me now. I needed a new ally who operated outside the courtroom. I reached for my phone with shaking hands. I called Patricia, my old friend with connections to the local precinct. She picked up on the second ring, her voice full of immediate concern. I told her about Sterling and the hidden debt Derek had hidden from me. She promised to send a patrol car to my house for the night. As I pulled out, I saw the black sedan follow at a distance. The predator was no longer my son. It was someone far worse. The black sedan remained a steady shadow in my rearview mirror. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like breaking bone. My objective was to fortify the house and secure the mineral rights deed. I locked the front door and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt. The house felt like a tomb filled with expensive memories. I grabbed my husband's old service revolver from the safe. Its weight was a cold comfort against my palm. I sat in the dark living room, watching the street through the slats of the blinds. The sedan parked 3 houses down, its headlights extinguished. My pulse thrummed in my ears, a rhythmic warning of approaching danger. Sterling was not a man who accepted refusal. He wanted the shale beneath my feet, and he would kill to get it. I realized the police presence Patricia promised was late. the silence outside grew thick and heavy with intent. A sudden scratching sound came from the back porch door. I crept through the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. I saw a dark figure working on the lock with a silver tool. I raised the revolver. My aim steady despite the terror. "Get back," I shouted, my voice cutting through the gloom. The figure froze, then slowly turned toward the glass. It was not Sterling's thug. It was Brittany, looking haggard and desperate. I opened the door an inch, keeping the weapon visible. Brittany stumbled inside. Her designer clothes stained with grease and dirt. She looked like a ghost of the woman I saw at the wedding. She told me that Sterling held her brother as collateral for Derek's gambling debt. The condo they bought was actually a front for a money laundering scheme. My son had tied us both to a sinking anchor. Brittany was terrified and needed a way out. She pulled a crumpled ledger from her bag and threw it on the counter. It contained the names of every local official on Sterling's secret payroll. This was the leverage I needed to break the injunction and the threats. Brittany had stolen it from Sterling's office while he was at the records building. She looked at me, her eyes red and sunken. "He's coming for the ledger?" she whispered. The power dynamic shifted. I was no longer just a victim. I scanned the pages, recognizing names from the City Planning Commission and the bank. Sterling's empire was built on a foundation of systematic bribery and forged titles. This ledger was a death warrant for his legal career and his freedom. I realized why he was so desperate to get me to sign the trust. He didn't just want the oil rights. He needed my property to bury the evidence of his crimes. The stakes were suddenly much higher. A heavy thud shook the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Sterling was tired of waiting and had decided to take what he wanted. I grabbed Brittany's arm and pulled her toward the basement stairs. We had to hide before he breached the final barricade. The police siren wailed in the distance, but it was miles away. As we descended, I realized the ledger had one final page missing. Someone had already betrayed Sterling. The basement smelled of damp earth and old laundry soap. We huddled behind a rusted furnace while the floorboards above groaned under heavy boots. Sterling was inside. I clutched the revolver, my finger resting lightly against the cold trigger guard. Brittany's breath was a ragged, terrifying hitch in the dark. She held the ledger to her chest like a shield. We heard a crash as my kitchen table flipped. Sterling was looking for the missing page. He knew we were down here. I signaled for Brittany to move toward the coal chute. It was a narrow opening that led to the side yard. If we could reach it, we might disappear into the fog. The footsteps stopped directly above our heads. A heavy silence followed, thick with a predator's patience. I realized Sterling wasn't just searching. He was waiting for us to make a sound. He wanted the ledger back more than he wanted the house. One mistake would end us both. Suddenly, a flashlight beam sliced through the floor joists. The light danced over stacks of old newspapers and empty jars. Sterling found the cellar door. He kicked the latch, and wood splintered with a sickening crack. I raised the gun, aiming at the narrow staircase. He began to descend, his polished shoes visible first. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like an executioner. The power in the room shifted toward the man with the light. "Give me the book, Margaret," Sterling called out. His voice was calm, but the edge was sharp. He stopped halfway down the stairs. I stepped into the light, keeping the revolver steady on his chest. Brittany cowered behind me, shaking with visible terror. I told him the police were already outside. He laughed, a dry sound that chilled my blood. He knew the patrol car was blocked by his sedan. We were entirely alone in the dark. Sterling stepped closer, ignoring the weapon in my hand. He held up a cell phone with a live video feed. I saw Derek in a prison orange jumpsuit, looking battered. A man stood behind my son with a sharpened shiv. The gambling debt wasn't just money. It was Derek's life. If I didn't hand over the ledger, my son would not survive the night. The pressure was a crushing weight on my soul. He had my boy. I looked at the phone, then back at Sterling's smirk. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. Brittany reached out, her fingers brushing my arm in a plea. She wanted me to save her husband. I thought of the stolen savings and the forged signatures. This was the final price of Derek's greed. I felt the cold metal of the gun. I had to choose between justice and my blood. It was a choice no mother should make. I lowered the revolver slowly, my shoulders slumped in defeat. Sterling reached out his hand for the heavy ledger. Brittany stepped forward to hand it over. As she did, she tripped on a loose floorboard. The ledger flew from her hands and hit the floor. The binding snapped, and several loose pages fluttered into the shadows. Sterling lunged for the papers, his focus momentarily broken. This was the opening I needed. I didn't shoot, I kicked. I sent the heavy furnace shovel into Sterling's shin. He grunted in pain and tumbled into a pile of crates. I grabbed Brittany's hand and bolted for the chute. We scrambled up the coal dust, our nails digging into the stone. The narrow opening was a tight squeeze for my aging frame. We pushed through into the freezing night air. The grass was slick with frost. We ran toward the woods behind the property. We were out, but not safe. We reached the old stone wall at the property line. I stopped to catch my breath, my lungs burning. Brittany pulled the missing ledger page from her shoe. She had stolen the most important evidence before we hid. It was a map of the local oil terminal. Sterling was tapping into the main pipeline illegally. This wasn't just bribery. It was massive corporate theft. The buyers weren't investors. They were a cartel. This detail changed the entire game. We heard the basement door fly open behind us. Sterling emerged into the yard, his face twisted in a mask of rage. He saw us by the wall and raised a silenced pistol. A single pop echoed, and a stone chip flew past my ear. I realized why the missing page was so vital. The oil terminal sat directly under the Oak Street rental. That house was the only access point they needed. The cartel was here for the fuel. The cold mud of the woods clung to my shoes as we scrambled away from the stone wall. Sterling's silenced pistol puffed again, the lead biting into a nearby oak with a dull thud. My objective was clear: reach the Henderson rental property before Sterling's thugs cut off the road. Brittany clutched the terminal map to her chest, her breathing shallow and frantic. The fog swallowed our shadows, but the sound of Sterling's heavy boots remained constant. He was relentless. We were fleeing through a literal graveyard of secrets. We emerged from the tree line near the back garden of the Oak Street house. The rental looked peaceful under the moonlight, oblivious to the industrial theft happening beneath its floorboards. I saw the faint glow of a television in the Hendersons' living room. They were inside, completely unaware that their home sat atop a strategic oil tap. If Sterling caught us here, he would likely burn the house down to hide the evidence. I felt the sharp weight of responsibility. I had to warn them. I reached the back door and hammered on the glass with my fist. Tom Henderson appeared, looking confused in his bathrobe. I shoved Brittany inside and locked the door before he could speak. I told him to get his family into the car immediately. Sterling was crossing the yard, the glint of his weapon visible in the porch light. Tom saw my revolver and didn't ask questions. He ran for the stairs to wake his sleeping children. The clock was finally ticking. Sterling reached the porch and kicked the door with a thunderous boom. The wood groaned, but held against the first strike. I moved to the kitchen window, checking for the black sedan. It was idling at the curb, blocking the driveway. We were trapped in a circle of steel and shadow. Brittany huddled under the table, tears streaking through the coal dust on her face. She whispered that the terminal tap was rigged with a remote detonator. Sterling was prepared to explode the line. The power balance shifted when I saw the control box on the kitchen counter. It was a small plastic housing disguised as a generic router. I realized Tom had been unknowingly hosting the tap's monitoring equipment for months. The cartel used the rental's internet to hide their data traffic. I grabbed a kitchen knife and pried the casing open. Inside, a series of blinking lights indicated the pressure levels of the stolen fuel. I could vent the line manually. This was my only real leverage. I shouted through the door, telling Sterling I had the control box. He stopped kicking and the silence returned to the porch. He warned me that venting the high-pressure line would level the entire block. I told him I would rather than let him kill my son. He hesitated, knowing the stolen oil was worth millions of dollars. The ledger page Brittany held gave me the exact bypass code. I began typing the sequence into the small keypad. My fingers felt like cold lead. The second floor creaked as Tom hurried his family down the hallway. They reached the kitchen, the children wide-eyed and shivering in their pajamas. I pointed toward the basement coal chute I had used earlier. It was their only exit that Sterling couldn't see from the front porch. Tom nodded, lifting his youngest child into his arms. They disappeared into the cellar, just as Sterling smashed the kitchen window. Glass rained down like diamonds. I stood my ground, my thumb hovering over the red vent button on the control box. Sterling climbed through the broken frame, his face a mask of sweating rage. He leveled the pistol at my head, his hand shaking slightly. He demanded the control box and the missing ledger page. Brittany crawled out from under the table, holding the paper out as a lure. She was distracting him while I finalized the pressure release. I saw the gauge hit the red zone on the small screen. The pipes beneath our feet began to hum. The vibration was a low, terrifying growl. "It's over, Sterling," I said, my voice as hard as the gun in my hand. He looked at the blinking red light and realized I wasn't bluffing. I had already rerouted the flow back to the main terminal sensors. The corporate security teams would be alerted to the massive pressure drop within seconds. He had nowhere left to hide his theft. The black sedan suddenly roared and sped away from the curb. His own crew was abandoning him to the coming sirens. He was truly alone. A distant explosion rocked the ground, but it wasn't the house. The safety valves at the terminal had triggered, cutting off the illegal tap. Sterling slumped against the counter, the pistol falling from his grip. He looked at the ledger page and then at me. He realized Derek's debt was now a debt to the state. The blue lights of the police cruisers finally reflected against the kitchen walls. I dropped the knife, feeling the adrenaline vanish. I had saved the house. The sirens wailed like banshees as the police swarmed the Oak Street property. Officers wrestled Sterling into the mud, his expensive wool coat ruined. I stood on the porch, watching the flashing blue lights illuminate the fractured wood of my front door. My son's gambling debt was now public record. The oil cartel was finally dismantled. Brittany sat on the steps, her head in her hands. The terror had passed, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the screams. The detective approached me with a somber expression, his notebook open. He confirmed that the evidence in the ledger would clear the property's title forever. My secondary objective was complete. I was no longer a victim of Derek's greed or Sterling's violence. The Hendersons emerged from the basement, hugging each other in the cold night air. I felt a surge of pride. I had protected my land and my people. However, the detective's next words stopped my heart entirely. He explained that Derek had cooperated with the authorities from his prison cell months ago. My son wasn't just a gambler, he was the original whistleblower. He had stolen my money to buy his way into the cartel's inner circle. The theft was a desperate attempt to gather evidence against Sterling's oil theft operation. Derek had played the villain to save us both from the cartel's reach. My perception of his betrayal shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I looked at the ledger Brittany had carried, seeing it with fresh eyes. The messy handwriting in the margins wasn't Brittany's. It was Derek's distinctive, slanted script. He had risked everything to document the bribery and the illegal pipeline tap. He didn't tell me, because he knew Sterling was watching my every move. Wedding was a staged event to distract the cartel while he moved the money. My son had been a hero in a monster's mask. The weight of my guilt crushed the breath from my lungs. I had prosecuted him, testified against him, and watched him go to prison. I believed the lie because it was easier than facing the truth of his danger. Brittany looked up, her eyes finally clearing. She admitted she was an undercover agent assigned to investigate the cartel and keep him alive. The Fiancé Act was a deep cover operation to secure the ledger. The world tilted on its axis as the truth surfaced. The detective handed me a sealed envelope from his pocket. It was a letter Derek had written before his sentencing. He told me he loved me and understood why I had to fight back. He wanted me to be safe above all else. I realized my son was coming home early on a special pardon. The restitution money would be returned by the government tomorrow. But as I turned the page, a final secret emerged. Derek wasn't alone.